he was a man who lived two lives in one body. On one side, he was the youngest CEO of a fast-growing tech company in his city. His face often appeared in business magazines, and investors praised his sharp mind and fearless decisions. On the other side, he was a single father raising a 5-year-old daughter who loved bedtime stories, peanut butter sandwiches, and dancing in the living room. To the outside world, he looked like a man who had everything under control, but those closest to him knew the truth: he was fighting a constant battle between responsibility at work and responsibility at home. His wife had passed away suddenly 2 years ago, leaving him with more pain than he could ever describe. In the silence of his home, when the world was not watching, he still felt the emptiness. But his little girl gave him strength. She was the reason he woke up early every morning, packed her small lunchbox with care, and made sure her laughter was louder than his worries. He promised himself that no matter how busy he became, he would never let her feel alone. At the same time, his company was on the edge of something big. For years, he and his team of engineers had been developing a new kind of technology that could change the way people used smart devices. Investors had already poured in millions, and customers were waiting. This product was supposed to be the company's greatest achievement. But there was one serious problem: a small flaw in the design that refused to be fixed. It was not something the customers could ignore, and until it was solved, the launch had to be delayed. Every delay cost them money. Every delay made the investors impatient. And every delay increased the pressure on him as CEO. He knew the reputation of the company rested on his shoulders. He had hired the best engineers he could find, men and women with top university degrees, years of experience, and brilliant problem-solving skills. Yet, despite all their knowledge, none of them could find a solution. He often sat at his office desk late into the night, staring at the glowing lights of the city outside. His phone buzzed with reminders, meeting schedules, and investor calls, but in his heart, all he thought about was his daughter asleep at home. Sometimes he felt guilty for leaving her with the nanny so often, but he told himself that this work was not just for him, it was for her future. The nanny, a kind woman in her late 40s, had been with the family for nearly a year. She had a warm, simple way about her. She didn't understand the world of business or engineering, but she understood children and understood the loneliness that sometimes sat in the CEO's eyes. She cared for his daughter like her own and quietly made sure the house still felt like a home. He often wondered how he would have managed without her. The days at the office became heavier as deadlines passed. Meetings were filled with tense voices, engineers scribbling formulas on whiteboards, long arguments about theories and solutions. Everyone was trying hard, but frustration was visible. Some engineers skipped meals, others stayed overnight, but no progress came. The CEO listened, encouraged, and pushed them forward, though inside, he too was filled with doubt. In quiet moments, he thought about his life before all of this, before the company grew so large, before investors and deadlines ruled his time. Back then, he worked from a small garage with only a few friends who believed in his dream. They built things with passion, laughed when they failed, and celebrated every small success. But now, everything felt different. Success brought weight. Responsibility brought fear. And loneliness made it harder. Still, he never let his team see his weakness. To them, he was the leader who never gave up. To his daughter, he was the father who always came home, even if late, and kissed her goodnight. That balance became his biggest struggle: how to be both without failing either side. One evening, after a long day of failed experiments, he returned home to find his daughter waiting at the window. She ran into his arms as soon as he stepped inside. In that moment, the stress of the office melted away. She asked him to tell her a story, and though he was exhausted, he sat with her and made one up about a king who had to protect both his kingdom and his only child. As he spoke, he realized the king was not just a character, it was him. But unlike the king in the story, he didn't have all the answers. He was learning every day, balancing mistakes with lessons, carrying grief while still smiling for his little girl. And though his heart often felt tired, he reminded himself of one simple truth: he could not give up. Not as a father. Not as a CEO. Not as a man who had promised to keep going no matter what. The problem at the company was still unsolved, and the pressure was building. He knew the coming weeks would test him more than ever. But in the quiet of his daughter's room that night, as she drifted to sleep holding his hand, he felt a flicker of hope. Somehow, some way, he would find a solution. He didn't know that the answer would come from the most unexpected person. The very woman who looked after his child when he could not. The next morning began with the same weight that had been hanging over the company for weeks. The CEO woke up before sunrise, quietly slipped out of bed so as not to disturb his sleeping daughter, and went into the kitchen where the nanny was already preparing breakfast. She handed him a cup of coffee with her usual calm smile and said, "You need strength today." He nodded, appreciating the small kindness, but his mind was already racing with numbers, schedules, and the endless problem that seemed to have no answer. By the time he reached the office, most of the engineers were already gathered. The whiteboards were covered with sketches, notes, and calculations that had been written and erased countless times. Empty coffee cups lined the tables, and tired eyes stared at screens that showed the same stubborn error again and again. Some of the engineers had been working through the night. They were among the best in the field, yet the flaw in the product still refused to be fixed. He walked into the room, straightened his tie, and greeted everyone with a determined voice, even though inside he felt the same frustration they did. "We are close," he told them, even if he wasn't sure. "We just need to look at this differently. No problem is impossible." His words gave the team a little hope, but they also felt the pressure. Everyone knew investors were expecting results soon, and the reputation of the company was at stake. The engineers got to work again. They tried adjusting the software, then altering the hardware, then combining both. They debated over small details, sometimes raising their voices, sometimes falling into heavy silence. The CEO stood among them, asking questions, challenging their assumptions, and encouraging them to test new approaches. Hours passed, but each attempt ended in failure. One engineer threw down his pen in frustration. Another rubbed his forehead, saying softly that maybe the flaw was simply unsolvable. The CEO refused to accept that. He reminded them that this project had already gone through years of effort, and giving up now would mean letting down everyone: the customers, the investors, and most of all, the team themselves. But as the hours stretched into days, morale began to sink. Even the brightest minds reached their limits. One evening, as the CEO walked past the meeting room, he overheard two engineers whispering that maybe they had overpromised, maybe the product was too ambitious, maybe it was time to go back to the drawing board. He paused at the doorway, the words hitting him like stones. For a moment, he doubted himself. Had he pushed the team too far? Was his vision unrealistic? Yet, when he thought of his daughter, when he imagined her future and the sacrifices he had made to build this company, he found a spark of determination again. He couldn't let doubt take over. He returned to the engineers and said firmly, "We are not leaving until we find the answer. Failure is not the end, it is just another step forward." His conviction reignited some of the energy in the room, but deep down, even he wondered how much longer they could go on like this. The engineers decided to divide the problem into smaller sections, each group focusing on a different angle. Some handled coding, others worked on physical design, and a few tested alternative prototypes. It was a smart approach, but still, no matter how they twisted the design, the flaw remained. It was as if the problem was mocking them, refusing to move. Tension grew heavier with each failed trial. The office that once buzzed with laughter and energy now echoed with sighs and quiet mutters. Coffee breaks turned into silent moments of staring at the floor. Some of the engineers started avoiding eye contact with the CEO, embarrassed by their lack of progress. He never scolded them. Instead, he carried the weight alone, taking late-night calls from investors who demanded updates, and then returning in the morning to encourage his exhausted team again. At home, his daughter noticed the tired lines on his face. She would ask, "Daddy, are you okay?" And he would smile and say, "Yes, sweetheart. Just busy with work." He never wanted her to see the stress that was crushing him. But the nanny noticed. She saw how he sometimes sat in silence at the dinner table, lost in thought, barely touching his food. She didn't ask questions, but she made sure his daughter laughed enough to fill the room, so he wouldn't feel the burden so heavily. One weekend, when most people were resting, the CEO gathered his engineers again. They filled the office, determined to push through, even though their energy was nearly gone. For 2 days straight, they tried everything they could imagine. By Sunday night, the CEO could see the defeat in their faces. Even his own hope began to dim. He stood at the window, looking at the city lights, and thought about the promises he had made to his team, to his investors, and to himself. He feared that if they failed, everything he had built would crumble. But despite all the failures, he refused to show despair. He turned to his engineers and told them to rest, assuring them that tomorrow was another chance. He thanked them sincerely, knowing how hard they had worked. Many of them looked surprised at his calmness, but his words gave them a little comfort. That night, as he drove home, his daughter was already asleep in the back seat of the nanny's car. He carried her inside, tucked her into bed, and kissed her forehead. As he turned off the light, the nanny asked gently, "Did it go any better today?" He shook his head and sighed. "No. 15 of the best minds tried, but the answer just isn't there." She didn't respond, only nodded with quiet understanding. What he didn't realize at that moment was that the solution was not hidden in complicated codes or advanced theories. The answer was something simple, something so ordinary that experts had overlooked it completely. And the person who would reveal it was not one of the 15 engineers, but the very woman who now stood in his living room, cleaning up after dinner while humming a soft tune. The following week began like all the others, with tension in the air and silence in the meeting room. The engineers were back at their desks, testing new theories and rewriting lines of code, but the atmosphere was heavy. Every face told the same story: tired eyes, frustrated minds, and a quiet fear of failure. The CEO moved from one table to another, offering encouragement, but even his words could not erase the exhaustion. He could sense that they were close to giving up. That evening, he had no choice but to bring his daughter with him to the office. The nanny came along, carrying a small bag with toys, snacks, and books to keep the child busy while her father worked. The little girl loved visiting the office, though she didn't understand why everyone seemed so serious. She skipped down the hallways, waved at the engineers, and filled the place with laughter that felt like fresh air in a suffocating room. The engineers smiled politely at her presence, but quickly went back to their endless calculations. The CEO, torn between fatherhood and leadership, felt guilty again. He wanted to take his daughter home, read her a story, and tuck her into bed, but duty pulled him toward the conference room where the unsolved problem still waited. He whispered to her, "Daddy will finish soon," though he didn't know if that was true. The nanny, sitting quietly in the corner with her knitting bag, observed the chaos of the office. She was not a technical person. She had never studied engineering, never written a single line of code, and never built a device in her life. But she had raised children, run a household, and solved 1,000 small problems with quick thinking and practical sense. To her, the world did not need to be complicated, it needed to be clear. As the engineers argued over formulas on the whiteboard, the nanny's attention drifted toward the prototype lying on the table. It was sleek, modern, and filled with buttons, wires, and tiny details. She didn't understand its inner workings, but she did notice something that no one else seemed to pay attention to. It was not a technical observation, it was something small, almost silly, that came from looking at the device with simple, ordinary eyes. She hesitated at first, thinking she had no right to interrupt such brilliant people. But then she remembered the many times the little girl had asked her to help fix a toy or untangle a necklace. The answer was usually simple, though the child thought it was impossible. Maybe, she thought, sometimes grown ups make problems bigger than they need to be. The room grew louder as the engineers reached another dead end. One of them groaned in frustration, saying they had tried everything. The CEO rubbed his temples, his face showing the weight of defeat. That was the moment the nanny stood up. She walked toward the table, gently picked up the prototype, and studied it for a few seconds. Then she said in her calm, steady voice, "Why don't you just try this?" The engineers turned to look at her, surprised. Some of them almost laughed, thinking it was a joke. How could someone with no technical background possibly understand what they had been struggling with for months? But the CEO, curious and desperate, asked, "What do you mean?" The nanny explained her observation in the simplest way. It wasn't a theory or a complex solution, just a straightforward idea, based on what she had noticed with her own eyes. To everyone's shock, it made sense. It was something so basic that the engineers had overlooked it completely, blinded by their focus on complicated solutions. "Let's test it," the CEO said firmly. The engineers hesitated, but obeyed. They adjusted the prototype exactly as the nanny suggested. The room fell silent as they turned it on, waiting for the usual error to appear. But this time, the device worked. Perfectly. Smoothly. As if the problem had never existed at all. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, gasps filled the room. Engineers looked at each other in disbelief, some even laughing at the irony. After weeks of sleepless nights, endless arguments, and failed theories, the flaw had been solved in less than 30 seconds by a woman who had never studied engineering. The CEO stared at the prototype, then at the nanny, his heart full of emotions he could hardly explain. Relief washed over him first, knowing the company was saved. Then came pride, because his team's work was finally complete. But above all, there was humility. He realized that brilliance is not always about degrees, titles, or years of experience. Sometimes, brilliance comes from seeing things differently from simple, untrained eyes that notice what experts forget. The engineers, though embarrassed, couldn't deny the truth. They applauded her, laughing at themselves for missing something so obvious. The nanny, blushing, shook her head and said, "I didn't do anything special. I just saw it the way I would see anything else." But to the CEO, it was more than special. It was extraordinary. His daughter, who had been playing with her dolls in the corner, clapped her little hands without understanding what had happened. "Did Nanny fix it, Daddy?" she asked. He knelt down beside her and hugged her tightly. "Yes, sweetheart. She fixed what no one else could." That night, as the engineers left the office with renewed energy, the CEO stayed behind with the nanny and his daughter. He thanked her again, this time more seriously, telling her she had saved not just the project, but the future of the company. She smiled modestly and said, "Sometimes we just need to stop thinking too hard and look at things simply." As he drove home, his mind replayed the events of the evening. He thought about how 15 brilliant engineers, including himself, had failed, while one woman with no technical background had seen the answer instantly. He felt humbled, almost embarrassed, but also deeply grateful. It was a reminder that intelligence is not only measured by knowledge, it is also measured by perspective. In the quiet of his home, after his daughter was asleep, he sat in the living room with the nanny. "You know," he said softly, "I think you taught me something far greater than just fixing a device. You taught me to listen." To pay attention to voices I might usually ignore. She looked at him kindly and replied, "We all have something to offer. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the clearest answers." He knew then that his leadership needed to change. It wasn't enough to rely only on experts and specialists. True innovation required diversity not just of skills, but of experiences, perspectives, and ways of thinking. That simple moment in the office had given him a vision for how his company could grow, not only in technology, but in culture. And so, the unexpected hero of the story was not one of the brilliant engineers, but the nanny who had walked into the room with nothing more than her natural wisdom and ordinary eyes. She had solved what seemed unsolvable, and in doing so, she had changed not just the project, but the CEO himself. The news of the breakthrough spread through the company like a spark in dry grass. By the next morning, every employee had heard the story of how the impossible problem had been solved. Some laughed in disbelief, others shook their heads with embarrassment, and many simply marveled at how a solution could hide in plain sight until seen through fresh eyes. The engineers, though humbled, also felt a strange sense of relief. After weeks of struggle, they finally had a working product. Their exhaustion turned into excitement, and the atmosphere of the office began to change. But for the CEO, the moment meant more than just relief. It was a turning point. All night he had thought about it, and he realized the lesson was far greater than the solution itself. For weeks, 15 experts had tried everything, but none had paused to see the problem from a simpler angle. They were trapped inside their own brilliance, blinded by their own knowledge. The nanny, untrained and ordinary in the world of technology, had no such barriers. She looked at the problem with honesty and simplicity, and that was why she found the answer. The CEO could not ignore the meaning of this. If one unexpected perspective could solve such a challenge, how many other opportunities had been missed because the right voices were not being heard? How many ideas had been overlooked because they did not come from someone with a title or a degree? He began to see leadership in a new light. For years, he had believed his role was to gather the smartest people, guide them, and push them toward solutions. But now he realized leadership was not just about gathering knowledge, it was about creating space for every voice, even the quiet ones, even the ones that seemed unrelated to the problem. The next week, he called for a company-wide meeting. The employees gathered in the main hall, expecting another technical update or a progress report. Instead, the CEO walked on stage with the nanny beside him. The crowd fell silent, surprised to see her standing there. She looked nervous, clutching her hands, but he placed a comforting arm on her shoulder and said, "This is the woman who solved what 15 engineers could not." She reminded us that sometimes the most powerful answers come from unexpected places. The hall erupted in applause. Some employees cheered, others laughed in amazement, but everyone clapped with genuine respect. The nanny smiled shyly, her cheeks red, but her eyes sparkled with warmth. The CEO continued, "From today, our company will change how we approach problems. We will no longer limit ideas to the experts in the room. We will invite new eyes, fresh perspectives, and voices we might normally overlook. Because true innovation is not about how complicated an idea is, it's about how effective it is." This announcement marked the beginning of a new culture inside the company. The CEO introduced Fresh Eyes sessions, where people from outside the technical team were invited to look at projects and give feedback. Sometimes it was interns. Sometimes it was people from the marketing or cleaning staff. Sometimes it was family members who visited the office. At first, the engineers were skeptical, but soon they began to see the value. Outsiders often noticed small details or raised questions that experts ignored. The change did more than improve ideas, it built unity. The company became a place where everyone felt respected, no matter their role. Engineers learned humility, realizing that intelligence did not mean having all the answers. Office staff gained confidence, knowing their opinions mattered. The CEO himself felt lighter, no longer carrying the weight of being the only one expected to see the unseen. At home, his daughter watched these changes too. She saw her father smiling more often, talking about teamwork in new ways, and spending more evenings at home instead of locked in the office. The nanny, though modest, became something of a legend in the company. Employees greeted her warmly when she visited, and the CEO often introduced her proudly as the person who saved their project. But alongside the joy came deeper reflection. The CEO thought about his own journey the way he had once believed that power and success meant always knowing the answers. He realized now that strength was not about control, it was about openness. He remembered the many nights he had stayed awake worrying, thinking he had to solve everything alone. If only he had trusted others sooner, if only he had let go of his pride, perhaps the breakthrough would have come earlier. The lesson humbled him. He began practicing it not just at work, but in his personal life. He listened more carefully to his daughter, even when her ideas sounded like the playful dreams of a child. He listened more attentively to the nanny, who often gave simple advice about balancing his time and health. He even started reaching out to friends and family, no longer hiding behind the excuse of being too busy. Slowly, his life began to feel fuller, less like a battlefield between fatherhood and leadership, and more like a journey where both could exist together. The engineers, too, changed. At first, some of them had felt embarrassed that an outsider had succeeded where they had failed. But as time passed, they began to tell the story with pride. "It took 15 of us to miss it," one engineer joked, "and only 30 seconds for her to see it." The laughter that followed was no longer bitter, it was freeing. They had learned to laugh at their own blind spots and embrace the wisdom of others. The company's product, now perfected, was launched successfully. Customers praised its smooth design, investors were thrilled, and the company's reputation soared. But for the CEO, the true victory was not the launch itself, it was the transformation that had taken place inside his people. In quiet moments, he often sat back and thought about the strange way life works. Sometimes the hardest battles are solved not by strength, but by humility. Sometimes the answers come not from the people you expect, but from those who see the world without complication. And sometimes the greatest leaders are those who are willing to step aside and let others shine. The nanny never claimed credit. To her, she had only made an observation, nothing more. But to the CEO, she had given him more than a solution, she had given him a lesson that would guide his entire future. And so, the struggles of the past weeks were not wasted. They had taught patience, reminded him of his limits, and shown him the power of looking beyond the obvious. The weight of failure had turned into the light of growth. The frustration of defeat had transformed into the humility of learning. What once seemed like an endless problem had become the key to a new way of living and leading. The launch of the product brought celebration to the entire company. Investors who had once grown impatient now praised the CEO for his persistence. Customers admired the new technology, and the market responded with excitement. The company's name appeared on business news channels, and journalists called it a breakthrough. Yet, in the middle of all the noise, the CEO remained calm. He knew that while the success of the product was important, the deeper success was what had happened inside him and his team. On the night of the launch, the office was decorated with balloons and banners. Employees gathered with their families, music played softly, and the cafeteria smelled of fresh food and cake. For many of the engineers, it was the first time they had smiled so freely in weeks. They laughed, joked about their endless nights of failure, and clapped each other on the back. The CEO stood at the center of the room, not as a distant leader, but as one of them, relieved, grateful, and proud. He made a short speech, thanking every member of the team for their effort, their sleepless nights, and their refusal to give up. But then, to everyone's surprise, he called the nanny forward. She shook her head, embarrassed, but the employees encouraged her with applause. "This woman," the CEO said, reminded us all that sometimes wisdom comes from the simplest place. She proved that no voice is too small to be heard. And because of her, we now know that our strength lies not just in knowledge, but in perspective. The room erupted in cheers. The nanny, red-faced but smiling, accepted a bouquet of flowers. She whispered to him afterward, "You didn't have to do that. I didn't do anything extraordinary." He smiled back and said, "Maybe not to you. But to us, you did something unforgettable." As the party continued, his daughter tugged at his sleeve and said proudly, "Daddy, Nanny is a hero." He nodded, kneeling down to meet her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. And you know what? So are you. You give me the strength to keep going every day." She wrapped her small arms around his neck, and in that embrace, he felt something no award or recognition could ever match. In the weeks that followed, the company's culture began to shine even brighter. The Fresh Eyes sessions became a tradition. People who once believed they had nothing valuable to add started to contribute ideas with confidence. The cleaning staff pointed out a small detail that helped improve safety in the office. A marketing intern suggested a feature that later became popular with customers. Even the engineers, once guarded about their technical world, welcomed these perspectives. They learned that true genius was not about being the smartest in the room, but about creating a room where every idea had a chance. The CEO found himself growing, not only as a leader but also as a father. He spent more evenings at home, no longer chained by the guilt of unfinished problems. He read bedtime stories to his daughter, helped her with small school projects, and sometimes even danced with her in the living room until they both laughed out of breath. The nanny often watched these moments quietly, her heart warm. She knew the balance he had struggled to find was slowly becoming real. Yet, success did not make him proud in an arrogant way. Instead, it made him more humble. He began speaking at conferences, not about how brilliant his company was, but about the power of humility and listening. He told the story of the 15 engineers and the nanny, always giving credit where it was due. His honesty surprised audiences, but it also inspired them. Many leaders, after hearing his story, began rethinking their own approach to problem solving. One day, a journalist asked him during an interview, what was the most important lesson from this experience? He answered without hesitation, that every person, no matter their background, holds a piece of wisdom the world needs. True leadership is not about having all the answers, it's about being willing to hear the answers, even when they come from unexpected places. At home, his daughter began to understand more as she grew older. She told her friends proudly that her nanny had saved her father's company. The nanny laughed whenever she heard this, but deep down, she too felt proud, not for recognition, but for the reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when given the chance. The CEO also realized something else. For so long, he had carried guilt for not being enough, for not being the perfect father, the perfect leader, or the perfect man. But now he understood that life was not about perfection. It was about balance, growth, and the courage to ask for help when needed. His journey as a single father was still difficult at times, but he no longer felt alone in it. He had his daughter, the nanny, and a company that had grown into a true family. Months later, when the company celebrated another successful milestone, the CEO stood quietly on the balcony, looking at the city lights. The nanny joined him, carrying 2 cups of tea. "You've come far," she said softly. He nodded, taking a sip. "Not just me. All of us." She smiled knowingly. Then, after a pause, she added, "You've learned to see differently." He looked at her, realizing she was right. The way he viewed people, problems, and even himself had changed. And it all began with one small moment, 30 seconds, that rewrote everything. As time went on, the story of the nanny became something of a legend in the company. New employees heard it during their first week, told by older staff with pride. It became a reminder to everyone, never underestimate where a solution might come from. It might be found in a complex formula, or it might be spoken by someone who simply sees the world without filters. For the CEO, it was more than just a company story. It was a life story. A reminder he carried with him every day that humility opens doors, that listening creates strength, and that love, whether in a family or a workplace, builds the foundation for true success. And so, the man who once struggled to balance two worlds, fatherhood and leadership, found a way to live them both. He no longer walked with the weight of trying to prove himself. Instead, he walked with the peace of knowing he did not have to do everything alone. His daughter saw him not only as her father but as her hero. His employees saw him not only as their CEO but as their guide. And he saw himself not as a man torn between roles, but as a man complete, shaped by the wisdom of others. In the end, the real victory was not the product that reached the market, nor the praise from investors. The real victory was the transformation of a man who discovered that leadership is not about control, but about humility, not about knowing everything, but about being open to everyone. It was about a single father who learned that sometimes the greatest solutions, the ones that save not just companies but also people, can come from the most unexpected voices. And every time he looked at his daughter and the nanny who had stood by his side, he knew he would never forget the lesson that had changed his life forever.